Although Churchill is considered to be one of Britain's greatest statesmen and the greatest war leader of all time, he does have a long record of shocking disregard for what he considered to be inferior races. Together with an overdeveloped sense of imperialistic superiority, being brought up during the late Victorian era, he epitomised the attitude of the British aristocratic elite towards aspirations of global dominance, regarding themselves as the apex of racial evolution and sophistication. Churchill was seen as at the most brutal and brutish end of the British imperialistic spectrum. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was warned by cabinet colleagues not to appoint him because his views were so antediluvian. His views towards Indian independence and the Indian people themselves are well documented. He saw all forms of independence as unnecessary competition, threatening the economic success of the British Empire. When airing his views towards Gandhi, he said, "He ought to be lain bound hand and foot at the gates of Delhi, and then trampled on by an enormous elephant with the new viceroy seated on its back." During my talk with Winston, he burst out with, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." And when he was pressed about the plight of the Palestinians, he commented, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wide race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." His career was littered with disastrous policies and ill-conceived campaigns which directly cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and indirectly the lives of millions when considering the knock-on effects. One could argue that nearly all the greatest tragedies concerning Western civilization during the first half of the 20th century had an element of Churchillian participation. Lord Robert Cecil once wrote that he believed Churchill took no interest in politics unless it involved the chance of a little bloodshed. In 1911, Churchill, at the age of 37, was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, the political head of the Royal Navy and the government's senior advisor on all naval affairs. As the war in Flanders stagnated, Churchill, one of the primary architects of the Gallipoli campaign, had convinced himself that opening up a second front, taking control of the Dardanelles and Istanbul, would put internal pressure on the fragile Ottoman Empire's leadership. He was prepared to gamble the lives of over 500,000 men on a reckless, optimistic chance that regime change would result from an attack at Gallipoli. Although Churchill was not alone in seeing potential advantages of the Gallipoli campaign, being First Lord of the Admiralty, he would ultimately take responsibility and become the scapegoat for its disastrous outcome. Being a sun sign Sagittarian, Churchill is prone to bouts of irresponsible and careless optimism. This is because Jupiter rules the sign, a planet associated with good fortune, abundance and optimism. This karmic disposition can lead to blind faith in one's own ability, ignoring credible contrary advice. The head of the Royal Navy at that time was 74-year-old Admiral John Fisher, a highly decorated and reputable leader with nearly 60 years naval experience. Fisher made it clear to Churchill that his plan was doomed to failure. Not only did Churchill disregard Fisher's advice, he also downplayed it in front of the War Cabinet, presenting Lord Asquith with an unbalanced, over-optimistic Churchillian view of the campaign, saying the war would be over by Christmas. Fisher resigned in protest over the matter, telling Churchill, "You are bent on forcing the Dardanelles, and nothing will turn you from it. Nothing. I know you so well." Although the operation came close to achieving its initial objectives, they had to call it off due to bad weather and heavy losses, putting an end to the naval campaign. Too many ships had been lost or damaged, confirming Admiral Fisher's worst fears. This left the land campaign to take over, which ultimately ended in another stalemate and shameful waste of human life. After almost a year of fierce fighting, the Allies abandoned the area, retreating in January 1916. Churchill ultimately took the majority of the flak for the failure of the campaign and was ousted from his position in the Admiralty. Feeling that his political career was over, he resigned and went to the Western Front to fight with the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He spent just over 3 months boosting morale by putting himself in dangerous situations before calling it a day and trying his luck back in Westminster. On May 1st, 1915, Cunard's Lusitania left New York for Liverpool, with almost 2,000 people on board. Although the Lusitania was fast, its captain and passengers believed the British Navy would escort them once they entered British waters, and also because 23 merchant ships had been sunk around the British coast in the previous 7 days. Churchill, being First Lord of the Admiralty, was aware of naval intelligence and the presence of U-boat 20 in the area where the Lusitania was to sail. Churchill was desperate to drag the US into the war. He was hoping for a shipping tragedy involving Americans on the scale of the Titanic, which would alter public opinion against Germany. He had previously sent a letter to the British Board of Trade. "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. For our part we want the traffic. The more the better, and if some of it gets into trouble, better still." The German government had placed a notice alongside the liner's ads, warning passengers of the danger of entering British waters. In a correspondence between Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, and Edward House, advisor to Woodrow Wilson, they discussed the implications of Germany sinking an ocean liner with Americans on board. Grey: "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" House: "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war." At 2:10 p.m. on the 7th of May, a torpedo struck the Lusitania, causing a small explosion. A few seconds later, a huge explosion rocked the ship. 18 minutes later, the ship had sunk, with 1,201 lives lost. As expected, the media backlash turned public opinion against Germany, which eventually led to the United States entering the war. John Morley, one of England's greatest liberals, said of Churchill, after working with him in 1908, "Winston has no principles." Churchill was British Chancellor of the Exchequer. from 1924 to 1929. During his time he championed what some see as the disastrous return to the gold standard, setting the stage for the biggest financial crash and greatest depression in human history. Keynes later wrote regarding the consequences of Churchill's gold standard that returning to the pre-World War I gold standard parity of £1 equals $4.86 would lead to a worldwide depression. Churchill's mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, was the daughter of a successful stock speculator, known in his day as the King of Wall Street. His real name was Leonard Jerome, the grandson of French Huguenots. During his lifetime he made and lost many fortunes, investing in railroads, newspapers and stocks. There is a high probability, being the King of Wall Street, that he had some form of contact within circles of the elite international banking community. Later in Churchill's life, he would confess that the return to the gold standard was one of the greatest mistakes of his life, which begs the question, how much influence did the city boys of London have over Churchill, possibly viewing him as their new political protege? After the Conservatives lost the 1929 general election, Churchill began to drift away from the party because of his stance on India and his close friendships with dubious financiers and press barons. That summer he decided to arrange a speaking tour across the Atlantic and set off for the United States. On October the 24th, 1929, a day which would go down in history as Black Thursday, a strange man appeared in the visitors' gallery of the New York Stock Exchange, eager to have a front row seat and to watch the action as the day's trading unfolded. The Great Depression has begun. Overlooking the scene of chaos in the visitors' gallery stands a short, dog-faced man who watches with a grim feeling of accomplishment. The enemy has been put to rout, he must have thought to himself. The whole wealth so swiftly gathered in the proper values of previous years vanished. The prosperity of millions of Americans had grown upon a gigantic structure of inflated credit, now suddenly proved phantom. The name of the watcher in the visitors' gallery was Winston Churchill. He had reason to gloat. The 1929 crash was a British operation. It signalled the end of a period of economic expansion greater than any Americans have known since, and closed the door to any American attempt at world economic leadership. On October the 29th, 1929, Churchill was guest of honour at a bizarre celebration attended by over 40 banksters and master plungers of Wall Street at the Fifth Avenue mansion of Bernard Baruch. In early 1942, the Japanese invaded Burma, which prompted the British to set up a huge military base in neighbouring Bengal. They took over farmland and destroyed crops as a contingency against further Japanese conquests. Also that year, there was a cyclone which destroyed further crops, leading to an outbreak of fungus which destroyed even more. The British also banned domestic shipping in the area, restricting trade and food supplies into Bengal. Once the famine took hold and became serious, requests for aid from India's government were rejected by Churchill. He also turned down offers of help from Canada and the US. While this was all going on, food which could have been used to alleviate the problem was used for stockpiles of already adequate supplies for the Allied forces in Britain and Europe. Between 1943 and 44, almost 3 million native Indians died of starvation as a result of the famine. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits.